Hi there, everybody. This is chapter 3 from this book, The Landmark History of the American People, and this is part 2. So we are on page 20 of your reading. So by an astonishing coincidence, gold was discovered in California in this very same year. Mexico handed over California to the United States. American gold rushers flocked to California by the tens of thousands. These people, too, would soon want to come into the Union as a state. But in 1849, there were 30 states, and the national scorecard showed 15 slave states against 15 free. To admit the state of California, as its people requested in 1850, would break the tie. How long could the National Balancing Act go on? The United States was now stretched from ocean to ocean. It had largely settled all its possible boundary disputes on the north and the south with Canada and Mexico. There was no more room to settle the slavery issue by promising neighboring territory to the north or to the south. Now the conflict had to take place inside the established boundaries of the nation. So they're tied 15-15. How are they going to figure this out? Early in 1850, more fear and hate than ever charged the air when the Senate met to decide the future of the territories taken from Mexico. Senator Calhoun from South Carolina made impossible demands. He actually prepared a constitutional amendment intended to provide for the election of 2 presidents, one from the slave states and one from the free. Senator Seward of New York called all compromise essentially vicious and refused even to appeal to the Constitution. He preferred a higher law. Senator Hay Clay of Kentucky led the forces of conciliation. He had a plan. By nature a compromiser, he had the half-hearted support of many people, but the enthusiasm of very few. The nation had 3 times defeated Clay for president, yet he sponsored the bundle of laws that later became the Compromise of 1850. He offered something for everybody, but he left the main question unanswered. Let's admit California as a free state, he said. That, he figured, was a boon to the North. Then he said, let's create a strong Fugitive Slave Act to protect the rights of Southern slave owners. Slave owners should have the right to recapture their property, slaves who run away to the North. So that would be a boon to the South. So if their slaves run away, they can go into the North and get them. Then Clay went on, let's abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia, where the city of Washington is located, something for the North. But let us permit slavery still to exist in Washington, something for the South. Clay never tried to answer the biggest question, whether all the rest of the new areas taken from Mexico should be free or slave. His compromise postponed the answer. He proposed that the people of those states should in the future decide that question for themselves when they applied to join the Union. Those who admire Clay's scheme called the last idea popular sovereignty. Those who disliked his proposal called it squatter sovereignty. And this matter of sovereignty held the seeds of war. Short-sighted optimists called this a final settlement, but a second look showed that it only put off the evil day. As usual in the years before a war, each side accused the other of acts of aggression. Both sides were right. Both freedom and slavery were aggressive. The champions of each rightly believed that each must expand or die. Pro-slavery forces in the South would not leave well enough alone. They had lost California, but that simply stirred them to push harder on the next round. The next round came sooner than most people expected, in 1854. People had been moving into the lands in the North left over from the Louisiana Purchase. It was time for these areas, and if you look, okay, so go back to this map, okay? This map on page 20, and you'll see there the Louisiana Purchase is the orange area, okay? So people have been moving into the lands in the North left over from the Louisiana Purchase. It was time for these areas to become territories so they could eventually become states. The question was, would they be free or slave? Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois took the lead. He argued that it was best for Congress to refuse to answer the most difficult question. He argued that the idea of popular sovereignty should extend into these northern regions. Let the people who actually live in these territories when they apply to become states decide whether their state should be slave or free. Let them decide the question democratically. And here's some pro-slavery men. There's a picture there on page 22 from Missouri. And we're going to hear about these guys called border ruffians. Douglas was a clever politician. After months of debate, he managed to get his Kansas-Nebraska bill passed in 1854. It seemed to keep an even balance between slave and free by allowing future new states to decide for themselves. But in truth, it was a great victory for the South, for the whole Kansas-Nebraska territory was north of the old freedom line drawn in the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. Popular sovereignty now opened those lands to the possibility of becoming slave states. If Senator Douglas thought his plan could somehow settle the slavery issue and hold the Union together, he was soon proven wrong. His Kansas-Nebraska Act aroused a strong new political force. Its members called themselves the Republican Party, and they organized themselves in 1854, the same year that Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. The new party drew together people who opposed allowing slavery into the new West. Senator Douglas had simply marked off a new battleground. This was no longer a battleground of words. New Englanders formed emigrant aid societies and collected money to send large numbers of anti-slavery people into Kansas to ensure it became a free state. Southerners sent in their pro-slavery settlers. Popular sovereignty became an invitation to civil war. By mid-1856, American citizens in Kansas were killing one another over slavery. On May 21, pro-slavery forces led by the Southern Colonel, and that's always a weird word. It's spelled C-O-L-O-N-E-L, and I always want to say colonel, but it's colonel. Colonel Jefferson Buford and his Kickapoo Rangers captured, sacked, and burned the anti-slavery town of Lawrence. Then John Brown took revenge with 4 of his sons and other anti-slavery men. Brown believed God had sent him to destroy slavery and slave owners. And with that sense of righteous authority, he and his friends hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death in what became known as the Potawatomi Massacre. So they killed some men. Clearly, the Congress of the United States could no longer ignore this central issue. By the time Congress considered the question of whether to admit Kansas as a state, there was not one Kansas government. There were 2, an anti-slavery and a pro-slavery. Each claimed to be the true and only government of Kansas. Congress eventually admitted Kansas as a free state in 1861, but by then the whole nation was preparing for war. Back in 1856, no one was sure whether Kansas would be free or slave, but everyone called it Bleeding Kansas. The spirit of violence reached into the very halls of the Senate. While the Congress was debating the Kansas issue, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts used every insulting word he could command to attack the South and several of its senators. Representative Preston S. Brooks of South Carolina was the nephew of one of the senators whom Sumner insulted. Brooks took it upon himself to avenge the honor of the South, and he did not win with words, but with a cane. On May 22, that's my birthday, 1856, he came up to Senator Sumner while Sumner was sitting in the Senate chamber. Brooks used his cane to beat Sumner until he lay on the floor unconscious. Brooks was reelected to his constituency and became a Southern hero. Senator Sumner, meanwhile, never regained his health, and Sumner became a Northern martyr. For several years, his empty seat in the Senate served as a vivid symbol that many Northern and Southern leaders would no longer speak to one another. We can be misled rather easily if we think that the years from 1820 to 1860 were years of compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. None of these were truly a compromise. Each was a truce in the war to the death. The issue was not finally to be settled by words and votes, but the fate of slavery was eventually settled on the battlefield. And we are going to start the Civil War, unfortunately. So slavery caused division, and the Republican Party was founded with an opposition to the spread of slavery. That's question number 2. Number 3, what kinds of jobs did Lincoln have before getting into politics, and how might these work? I'm so sorry. I was on the wrong questions. Let's start again. First of all, the word conciliation, okay, means mediating between 2 parties. So we're going to kind of make them get along better. So what did the Fugitive Slave Act accomplish? The Fugitive Slave Act allowed Southern slave owners to recapture their slaves, even if they ran away to the North. Question 2, what looming problem did Clay's solution avoid entirely? And his solution avoided what to do about all the new territory taken from Mexico. Should they make it slave or free? How did allowing Kansas to vote for itself, whether or not to be slave or free, work out? It caused a lot of problems, right? It resulted in 2 Kansas governments. Okay, so those are the questions. I'm going to have a couple of little videos, I think, for you to watch. So check on the bottom of the screen for the videos.